Yeah. So my presentation also connects quite nicely with the two previous presentations. Although mine is focusing on the migration aspect of colonial archives and digitizing migrated colonial archives, infrastructures, and connections. I should mention also that I've been working on this material that I will be talking about today throughout my postdoc, and it's also connects with my current research project, Tracks Through Nature, which is about the expansion of transport infrastructures and also communications infrastructures in Western and Central India in the 1860s. So let me also say that I'm an historian of South Asian history, first and foremost, and my digital history tag is quite small. I teach on the digital history course, and I've been working with digitization of archives as an intern when I was a PhD student at the League of Nations archives in Geneva for 3 months, where we did the first prototype for the total digitization of the League of Nations archives for 3 months with the archivist Colin Wells there. And then he got this humongous grant, which is doing like incredible digitization project, right? So I've been following the discussions for quite some time now, and it keeps coming back to me in different forms. Here it is a very, very small project, a very, very small digitization of an archive that I will be talking about. So let me start. In 2008, a box surfaced in the cleaning of the attic at Huseby Estate in Småland in southern Sweden, not far from the venue of this conference. The Huseby Estate, known to many here perhaps, is well known in history in the 16th and 17th century for its manufacture of cannons, ammunition, and a particular type of ovens, so-called sättugnar. And later, the period that I will be talking about, in the second half of the 19th century, it is famous for the ironworks and the forestry production, which then flourished into the early 20th century. In this box, discovered by chance, was a stack of papers, a set of documents which turned out to be the private correspondence and work records of Joseph Stevens, the estate's then new owner in 1867. The box had arrived from Bombay at the end of the 1860s and was left untouched until 2008, in other words, for almost 140 years in the attic here in Småland. Joseph Stevens, born to British parents in Stockholm and since his teenage years settled with a family in Copenhagen, traveled from Denmark to Bombay to spend 3 years with his brother-in-law, a third-grade engineer at the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, as an apprentice to become a civil engineer. First he worked as an assistant and then as a subcontractor and finally as a contractor in India, where he stayed for nearly 10 years, except for a very short visit to Sweden to buy Huseby Estate in 1867. Then he settled down there for life in 1870. The main purpose for traveling to India was to make money. Just like other European men from lower middle class or middle class backgrounds with some or few connections, he and his family saw the opportunity to make money out of the British imperial expansion in South Asia at that point of time. So throughout the 1860s, he worked as a contractor on the massive railway construction projects in Western and Central India. A contractor like Stevens, like the title sort of conveys, but it's important to be aware of that is very different from being a civil engineer and constructing the railways. The role of a contractor is to sign a contract to supply materials or workers to perform a service. So as a subcontractor, he was then signing contracts with contractors, i.e. taking shares of bigger contracts, and in then supplying the workers or the somehow also services, not necessarily on the labor even. To most historians, the documents from the Indian period are not of interest because of Stevens' life story. It might be fascinating, this conveyance of 10 years in India, but rather because people like Stevens and the people who worked under him are largely undocumented in the colonial archives. So the archive from Stevens' time in India consists of letters, diaries, contracts, accounts, drawings, and payrolls, which provide a very unique insight into subcontracting and local laborers' working conditions. The archiving of Joseph Stevens' papers related to his so-called Indian period, a very short span of his life, 10 years, and is only 2 shelf meters, 9 volumes, approximately 2,000 entries. The digitization of Stevens' Indian papers have largely been research-driven, but not as part of a research project, but initiated by the Linnaeus University Library in order to facilitate access to the rare material for international researchers. However, as we are aware of, and as we have been talking about quite intensively already today, digitization of archives means creating new record-keeping infrastructures. And these infrastructures shape new interfaces between the documents created in the past for the users today. So with the digital comes different catalogs and formats to use these sources, such as online catalog system Klara here at LNU, as well as the platform Alvin, whom I suppose many of you are very familiar with. And of course also the classical PDF catalog uploaded in a library page. So I skipped the PDF here, but you know how they look, sort of. And of course, as we can see in Alvin, we don't have an archival structure on display. So you have to combine these two digital catalogs to actually understand where the document is in the structure. So all the documents, digitized versions, are uploaded in Alvin with the correct tagging of titles and so forth. But the actual archival structure you only find in the PDF and more details so in the digital Klara archival catalog. So revisiting the history of these archives, which I want to point to here, it can help us to situate how the digitization of Stevens' Indian papers revisiting the history of these archives, they help us to situate the digitizations of Stevens' Indian papers within the bigger debates, which are interesting here to discuss, on provenance, custody, and access, and how these sort of have a multi-directional relationship to each other. So if we look at the history of these papers and why they are interesting, we also come to the migratory side of them in many ways, in multiple ways, which I would like to emphasize here today. Why these papers are of particular interest is directly linked to the migration in the empire of people like Stevens and of the migrant workers. Exactly the period which Stevens spent in India, the 1860s, coincided with the so-called contractor system. It was a specific period in the expansion of construction work infrastructure work in India. And this was a way so the construction of railways and a supportive infrastructure could be built quickly. The purpose of the railways was also very clear from the outset. It was to transport raw materials from the inland, the agricultural fields, to the harbour in Bombay for onward transport to the mills in the UK. The main railway line that Stevens worked on would also connect it to imperial metropoles, Calcutta and Bombay, furthering business exports as well as the colonial states' concern with security at that time, especially then after the First War of Indian Independence in 1857. However, at this point also we have the outbreak of the Civil War in America, 1861-65, and this added another level of urgency to the construction of railways. The war had blocked Great Britain's access to the North American cotton market, and the inferior Indian cotton was suddenly in high demand. Stevens also got contracts for building cotton presses, and this was necessary then in order to transport the cotton, which contributed to his considerable profits. Like the contractors, like Stevens, who had come there to work to shuttle between these different contracts and expand the railways and the side infrastructures, the workers were also migrants. The migrant workers, so-called contract labor, were landless labor who lived their lives on construction sites and alternatively worked as agricultural labor depending on the seasons. Here we have in this picture then from Stevens' collection at Huseby, a photo album that he bought on the railway construction, and here are some of these migrant laborers, then the contract laborers who live literally along the roads which transport the materials for the construction. In this way, they traveled through the region of Western and Central India where there was a need and also where they got the best payment for the services for carrying soil, stones, construction materials, or digging and breaking stones. Their migratory status and very low literacy levels partially explain why they are largely absent in any written material from this period. However, another reason for the lack of sources on workers and contractors, both these two entities, in this period, is the structure and buildup of the colonial administration for constructing infrastructure during this period. In the contract system, the contracts were sold to the large business contractors, firms who competed with each other in the bidding on contracts. Some of these contractors were based in the UK, and famously, they never visited India. While others often had businesses in India, hence they had both capital, skill, staff, and networks to so what we call win a contract. And then they did in turn sell parts of these contracts to Europeans and to Parsi contractors, who had more or less established firms in the metropoles. So what we see here is contract number 13 from the Maharashtra State Archives. It is not a part of Stevens's collection, but it is the contract which he actually works on, but in subcontracts. And so all the towns that are marked along this line, he has constructed some sort of a building or a shed or platform and so forth, small parts of the railways, bits and pieces. As a subcontract then, he sourced the labor and construction materials for the big railway contractors, often then managing labor teams in hundreds through a headman. So as a middleman, where his profit was made from the difference between the contract he took and the cost of labor, that was how you could make a good cut from these contracts. Stevens worked much further down in these organizational hierarchies compared to the big contractors. Men like him, not unlike the workers, are not in the record of the colonial archive from this period. Stevens never feature in the colonial records if we go to the Indian official records. And only occasional correspondence and documents from these kind of contractors are found in the big papers of like higher up in the hierarchy or in railway engineers' papers and so forth. And in this kind of a pay sheet then, which we have in a not completely unbroken line, but to a great extent, which is, again, it is extremely rare to find in the colonial period from the 1860s in South Asia, when we had this humongous infrastructural expansion that connected migration, but also trade, importantly, at that point. So what we have here is then the actual shifts or the work that they put in. We can also deduce from some of the names then sort of religious belonging or community belonging. We have age, if it's boys or girls, if it's women and men and so forth, if they have absconded, if they have died, for example. And of course also the salary, which is very interesting to labor historians and economic historians working on this period. And this is then one side of the material which has been utilized a lot in the postdoc by postdoc researchers working at Linnaeus University prior to me. So his job, so the papers then resurface here in Småland. How does they help to explain how both professional expertise and colonial capital ended up in the region and in the regional economy of Småland? Stevens had, by his cultured but financially relatively poor father, George Stevens, who was actually a professor at Copenhagen University, he had been told specifically to buy a landed estate with his profit. And partly, but of course not the main reason, but the father had a huge book collection, which had outgrown his small house in Copenhagen. So Småland was at that time reeling from what became Sweden's last great hunger of 1866-67. So according to secondary sources, at this point of time, 66-67, 250 foreign buyers buy up landed estate in Småland at this point of time. and or farms also in the region around Huseby, and many of them are Danes and Germans who are interested in the agricultural land, but also in timber for export purpose. And this is also then what actually boosts Huseby when Stevens take over. Through his contacts in Bombay and in the UK, Stephen initiates successful and unsuccessful export attempts of timber, butter, and also some of the first cycle prototypes made in Sweden were actually produced at Huseby, and not surprisingly here, exported to the UK and to Bombay. He sent the cycles to Bombay first. And even though it takes time to implement, he's part of this infrastructural expansion in the form of railways in Småland. We see him here in this photo with some of the great men of the regions and probably timber merchants. I think one of them is the Warburg from Gothenburg, for example, who traded in timber and had some small production units there. So this was how he turned the economy of the estate in the 1860s. What I would say here is that in this way, the migration of the papers from India provides an understanding for the economic investments made by Stevens. Professional training and experience from contracting in India led him to invest in a forestry and small-scale technology-based industry, which he built up largely from scratch. And promoted partly with the imperial markets in mind. What the markets he sought were the harbors towards, of course, the harbors in Sweden, also Gothenburg and Malmö, Karlskrona and Karlshamn, but also in the UK market and his contacts that he had in Bombay, who were then also, making business across India. So he was looking at other markets that was based on his experience when he came here. So what I would say here is, just to finish off, I have 2 minutes left, perfect. The digitization of these papers, as I mentioned, is an extremely small section of the larger Huseby archives and also of Stevens' paper as such. But it also points to some of the methodological challenges but also possibilities that come with digitizing specifically these migrated archives, which I have pointed to, I hope, in my presentation. A migrated archive is here used to describe an archive which has traveled, but it has not necessarily been displaced by colonial administration, which we see in other case studies. Or it has not been displaced by an individual or a company consciously or forcefully or happenstance. However, as Joseph Stevens' archives has made evident, the travel and migration routes were part of these colonial expansions in the 19th century, which resulted in collections and papers migrating with persons involved exactly in this colonial enterprise that built on migration. It could also be, for example, missionaries and government officials or explorers, or the entrepreneuring young men like Joseph Stevens. More collections similar to Stevens are not unlikely to surface, yet the travel routes and migration inherent in the profession of a contractor to him made it unlikely that papers were preserved for a longer time. The possibilities and challenges of this digitized migrated archive, in this case and potentially also in other, is the ability to contextualize and recontextualize collections that were, one, never meant to be archived. They hold rare data and perspectives. But they will also remain and not be repatriated, since there is no home to return to for these collections, partly also since archival practices assemble them as a part of the private papers of individuals who have migrated. They belong with Joseph Stevens' papers here. And there are also no descendants of these documented communities, and there are no movement for digital reunifications of scattered materials in these cases. From the outside, this kind of archival silencing of these sources are of no surprise to the historians of South Asia. They were very much in line with the colonial administrative practice, which ignored or lacked access to this level of the economy then and there of the creation stage. At the same time, some of these documents are very mundane and recurring, and the inclusion of many of these documents would seem pointless to preserve or prioritized by most archival practices. They were never meant to be saved. At the same time, migrated archives and displaced archives share a higher risk of getting ruined for several reasons, potentially from curatorial negligence, lack of knowledge about their significance, or being seen as different from the national or larger collections of often locally rooted archival material, like we see in the Huseby case, where it is a very regional archive based on this estate. I think I will finish here, so I'm on time. Thank you.